Hello, and welcome to American Heron Wargaming. This is a tournament debrief for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. As I've been getting into 40k this year, I heard about an interesting opportunity to try a slightly different way to play the game, a team tournament. This sounded really interesting to me, where instead of being paired up individually against other players at the tournament based on your individual score, teams of 5 players are paired off and then have to go through a secondary pairing procedure to determine which the matches are. Each team chooses one defender player and presents that to the opposing team. The opposing team then selects 2 potential attacker players and responds with them. Then the defender chooses which of those 2 they want to fight. The process is repeated again, and by the end, all 5 players on each team are matched up. Through this process, teams are able to set up favorable matches for themselves, or at least not unfavorable ones. 40k seems to be pretty well balanced at this point, with each faction of the game sitting in around a 45 to 55% win rate at the competitive level. But this doesn't mean that each faction, and especially each army type, is completely balanced against the others. Different force archetypes have good and bad matchups. In an individual tournament, if you're paired up against an army that's a hard counter to yours, you're basically starting way in the hole without a lot of hope. This team format changes that around, allowing players to build more specialized forces so that the team has a mix of different archetypes to handle different types of opponents. This level of team meta composition was something I'd not been exposed to before, and it was really engaging to sit down with my team and talk about what armies we had, what we were expecting to see, and what we should build to deal with it. In the end, our team brought Grey Knights, Black Templars, Chaos Space Marines, the Astra Militarum, and the Leagues of Votann, fielded by me. We'd agreed that my position was to lean somewhat anti-tank, but not overcommit too hard into that. To that end, here's my list. 1 call with the Appraising Glare, Volkite Disintegrator, and a Concussion Gauntlet. 2 Einherjar Champions, both with Mass Hammers. 2 units of Battle Line Hearthkin Warriors, 1 with Bolters, a Missile Launcher, and a Rotary Cannon. The other had Ion Blasters, a Plasma Beamer, and a Rail Rifle. 3 units of Hearthguard Warriors, 5 men each. 2 of the squads had the Volkite Disintegrators and Concussion Gauntlets, and the other squad had Edekarn Plasma Guns and Concussion Gauntlets. The Plasma Squad and 1 of the Volkite squads had Teleport Crests to allow them to deep strike. 2 units of Brokir Thunderkin, 3 each, armed with Graviton Blast Cannons. 1 unit of Hernkin Jaegers armed with knives and pistols, taking a sniper rifle and the APM launcher. 2 squads of 3 Hernkin Pioneers with rotary cannons, searchlights, and the Pan-Spectral Scanner. 2 Sagittars with missile launchers. And finally, 2 chunky Hecatons with the SP Conversion Beamer and Bolters. The Hecatons and the Thunderkin were the basis of the anti-armor focus, but the Hearthguard hit vehicles pretty hard too, especially when led by an E-Champ. A somewhat controversial opinion was taking the missile launchers on the Sagittars instead of the high-las casino cannons, but I tend to prefer consistency in my weapon profiles than the crazy spikes which can't be counted on. The plan was mainly to be flexible in deployment. Depending on what my opponent was fielding, I switch it out if I'm running the Thunderkin or the Hearthguard in Hecatons or reserves, or even just on the field. Each character would lead a separate 5-man brick of the Hearthguard to give them their extra bodyguard rule. The Hearthkin were always split into 4 or 5-man squads, 1 each in a Sagittar, 1 sitting on my home objective, and 1 in strategic reserves. The Jaegers were there to screen and maybe do some secondaries, and the Pioneers were there for early snipes and uppy-downy shenanigans. Rather than leave you guessing, I'll let you know how the results ended up before going through each game. 2 wins and 3 losses. Considering that this is only my second 40k tournament ever, I actually feel pretty good about this. I learned a ton, and given the caliber of most of my opponents, I feel like that's a result that I can be happy with. Our team came in next to last. One of our players actually had to drop out due to illness, and we were able to secure a last-minute stand-in, which was great. However, we knew going into this that we were probably not destined for the final podium, and we were okay with that. For most of us, this was our first team tournament, and for the others, it was the first tournament in a long while. So we were mainly there to play a good number of games, match up against different armies and good players, have a good time, and learn more. In that regard, I think we were very successful. My first game was a loss against the Dark Angels. The mission was Taken Hold with a Raised Banners rule and a tipping point deployment. Mission A from the Tournament Companion. My opponent brought lots of Deathwing Knights, which have -1 damage, and with their maces have built-in anti-vehicle 4+, which my Hecatons and Sagittars were not happy about. This was not a chosen or forced matchup if I recall, we were just the last unassigned players on our respective teams. I deployed a bit more aggressively than I should have, hoping to catch some good firing lanes and not wanting to get pinned in my deployment zone. However, with an advance in charge ability, the Terminator sprinted up across the board and pinned me in my deployment zone, keeping me from scoring points and doing gobs of damage while taking little in return. I snagged some points where I could, but it was a pretty brutal defeat. Game 2 was against the Astra Militarum with the Scorched Earth primary objective, Stalwart's mission rule, and Search and Destroy deployment. Mission K. I was feeling much more comfortable about this matchup. Since one of my teammates was playing the guard, I'd gotten in some practice games against them and had a better idea of their unit's abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. My opponent had 3 Bulgrin blocks, lots of scions, and some armored firepower. Most of their army was actually old converted models or proxies, which I was kind of surprised to see in a tournament that was supposed to be very strict about WYSIWYG, but I don't really mind. This one was a much narrower loss, and due mainly to a huge mistake on my part. Despite knowing that my opponent had 3 loaded up squads of scions that could deep strike, I failed to screen out my home objective. At one point, I'd pulled up a Hernkin Pioneer for the sole purpose of redeploying in the backfield, and then completely forgot about that, letting my opponent drop a significant amount of force in my home area. Since I didn't want to let him burn my home objective, I had to commit a significant amount of my forces to holding that off, which I was able to do, but at the expense of not being able to bring them to bear elsewhere. On a turn where I got the Bring It Down secondary mission, I had to leave 2 Lehman Russ tanks with a single wound remaining, unable to close them out because I didn't have enough firepower where it was needed. So that stung a bit, but it was a stark reminder to watch out for your own backfield, and don't forget your own plan. The final match for the day was Mission O, Terraform with Stalwarts and Crucible Battle Deployment. My opponent was playing Dread Mob Orcs, and as soon as I realized I was facing Orcs, I requested that we play on the clock. I've faced Orcs before, and I know that their turns can take a long time, and I wanted to be able to play as much of the game as I should be allotted. I didn't get many photos of that match because playing on the clock is a bit more high intensity, but essentially my big scary anti-vehicle shooters kept my opponent pinned on their side of the board. Anything that popped its head out got popped. I also drew some excellent secondaries: recover assets and sabotage in turn 1 for easy scoring, establish locus and area denial in turn 2, etc. My opponent clocked out at the end of their turn 3, and I still had about 30 minutes on my side of the clock. Since it was the last game of the day, we talked out the rest, and I walked away with a solid win. The first game of day 2 was Mission B, Purge the Foe, Smoke and Mirrors, and Tipping Point. This was my first game ever against Drukhari, and I was a bit anxious about that matchup. They didn't have many vehicles, and Haywire Blasters have scored a dark mark in my heart. They're one of the few things which eat my beloved Hecatons alive. So I decided to play a bit more restrained. In my first turn I drew Extend Battle Lines and Secure No Man's Land. So I sent 1 poor squad of Hearthkin onto that middle objective to score points and then die, which they did, fearlessly. Turns 1 and 2 were cagey for both of us, both having the ability to tear serious chunks out of the other one's forces. However, I got fantastic secondary mission draws on turn 2 as well, pulling well ahead on points and forcing my opponent to make turn 3 the go turn, pushing hard against my flank. However, due to some bad rolls on their side and some good saves on mine, it held, and when time was called, there hadn't been enough carnage to turn the tide. The last game of the tournament was Mission H, Supply Drop, Smoke and Mirrors, and Hammer and Anvil. I was up against Orcs again, this time the Bully Boys, featuring Gazgul, 2 Knob Mobs, a Death Killer War Trike, some Storm Boys, and 3 squads of Commandos. Our setup got a bit squirrely to start, so I never found the right moment to say that we should start a clock, and even during deployment began to regret that immensely. Every range needed to be doubled and triple checked, and every sightline measured with lasers, and safe spots were designated by dice. I understand the margins that Orcs can run on. If you leave one model slightly exposed, you can have a whole big mob vulnerable to some punishing fire. But we were on a terrain-heavy map. I was already having trouble getting any sightlines anyways. Turn 1 went well for my opponent. They got the ideal combo of area denial and secure no man's land. Just send up a squad or 2 of chaff to score the points, move block, and then die. I knew that if I pushed up at all, I was going to be serving myself up for a platter for the turn 2 wah, so I pulled back. But that wasn't even far enough though. As with that move, advance, and charge combo, not to mention making multiple 9 and 10 inch charges, I was awash in Orcs. It went predictably. One of the Hecatons went down, and with a well done wrap, the Hearthguard actually needed to do a desperate breakout when it exploded. I rallied a bit on my turn 2, cutting down one of the Knob Mobs, and putting a hurt into the Commandos, but Gazgul was able to heroically intervene into my combat, and set himself up to take my home objective on turn 3. As the mini-wad turn drew to a close and much carnage had been done, we got the notice from the tournament organizers that there were only about 10 minutes left before we needed to report scores. My opponent hadn't even finished up their 3rd turn, and I'd played about my 2 quickest turns of 40k so far, so I was a bit unhappy about not having the opportunity to mount any sort of recovery. But since the time was drawing close, I offered to concede and score us up to the end of my opponent's turn, not even bothering to draw my own secondaries for turn 3. My opponent refused that offer, saying that instead they wanted to talk out the remainder of the game, as it would allow them to run up the score on me. As their team was actually in the running for a podium position, it would help their place in the rankings. I was stunned. This person had spent the last 3 hours beating the snot out of me and hagging all of the game time, and then was refusing to accept my concession because it wasn't enough for them. I was so stunned by the poor sportsmanship that I told them to just take the full win, scoop my army, and packed out. I'm not sure if this is the sort of thing that's common in 40k tournaments, but in my other competitive gaming events, I've never experienced anything so disrespectful before. In the end, I took 2 key lessons away from that game. I really need to learn how to screen better, and that I should never, ever hesitate to ask my opponent to play on a clock. Since I've started doing that myself in my practice games, I've found that it really does force me to think faster and harder about the game. I've made mistakes, critical mistakes sometimes, and clocked myself out as well, but I've got to say that it has always felt fairer to me than not getting to play a full game because I or my opponent was taking an age to finish. Many of my games are played at the friendly local game store, but you have to book a table, and they hold you to those booking times, as they're often in high demand. So learning to play fast and think fast means that everybody gets to have a better and fairer time. Despite how that last game went, I'm still very happy about my first team tournament experience. Like I said earlier, I learned a lot about higher level play strategies, and got a chance to face folks that aren't in my usual circle, so I got to see some new armies and factions that I don't usually get to come across. In terms of my list's performance, I actually felt pretty good about it. I knew melee forces were going to be an issue, and at least was pleased to see that my assessment of the situation was accurate. One decision I'd wavered on during list building was whether to run 3 breaks of 5 Hearthguard, or 1 squad of 5 and a bigger squad of 10. I'd found in test games that the 10-man squad would show up, put in some serious work, but then would often be out of position to contribute for the rest of the game, and that larger squad footprint made deep striking more difficult. I think going with a 3x5 approach worked fairly well, even if it meant having to sacrifice some of the force that I could bring to bear. The Hurricane Jaegers were definitely a standout unit, because they did basically nothing in most games, and that was the point. They would set up at or near my closest out-of-deployment zone objective, and do actions and sit on that point. That let the Hearthkin and Sagittars present a threat in terms of objective control, and basically whenever I had a secondary mission that required sitting on a point or being near a certain part of the map, the Jaegers helped facilitate that. They were never a factor in shooting or combat, but they scored victory points, and for only 80 points they were efficient at that. The Thunderkin were also fairly decent. I know that overall they're rated as one of the Votann's least effective datasheets, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, but having 1 squad in a Hecaton and another in strategic reserve gave me a lot of good options. Their ability to hit Overwatch shots on 5s instead of 6s, while not being a major factor, would sometimes have opponents paying KGR around them. I love the Graviton Blast Cannons, but I'm also thinking that the Conversion Beamers or even the Bolt Cannons might be worth investigating. They're also only an 85 point investment, for 9 wounds on Toughness 6 with a 3+ save, so at times I even had them working as action monkeys. The Hearthguard and Hecatons were the hammers and anvils they are built to be, though I've been noticing that the Hearthguard do seem to go down faster than elite infantry of other forces. Without an invulnerable save or a feel no pain and only 2 wounds, they drop more often than I'd like. Wood armor as a stratagem is good, but it costs a command point and you can only use it once in a phase. I constantly found myself running low on command points, even in games when I got my CP Pinata scored in the first turn or 2. I'm not sure if I'm leaning too hard on our stratagems as a crutch, or if Votann is just a CP hungry army in general, but I do find that the right stratagem at the right moment can really turn the tide. To bring all this to a close, team tournaments are fun, and I would highly recommend them, especially when you have great teammates like I did, and an organization staff that was really on the ball and ran a great event. That's all for now, and don't forget, the ancestors are watching.